What if the simmering flesh of the dead held the secret of immortality rather than holy relics or alchemical formulas? Because of his conviction, one scientist took a route that made it difficult to distinguish between madness and medicine. We'll look at the precise temperature at which he thought the soul's binding agent could be extracted from human tissue tonight. I want to know who is here with us, so before we start, please leave a comment with your name, city, and time of day you are tuning in. This is a tale of obsession, of science overreached, and of the gory things one man did to try to live forever. His methods are still in use, preserved in sporadic notes and appalled murmurs, but his name has all but vanished. A curious paradox can be found in the records of 17th century Prague. Detailed accounts of horrifying experiments, but only shards of information about the man who carried them out. While medical tribunal transcripts mention a professor who is accused of breaking burial ordinances, municipal sanitation reports mention the Swiss anatomist, whose work left neighborhood wells contaminated with an oily residue. However, no official document has a complete name. Contemporaries who wrote about his work called him the distillation master, the corpse alchemist, or just that foreign doctor, suggesting that this erasure was intentional. The strongest indications of his identity are preserved in 3 fragile manuscripts. Payments made to Dr. Christophorus H. for unidentified medical consultations are documented in a 1632 chemist's logbook. In 1629, a university rector's private journal records that he reprimanded a man named Hans Henkel for using cadavers improperly. Historians continue to argue whether this refers to the elusive scientist or another practitioner, but the most telling document is a single page from a destroyed anatomy text with marginal notes in shaky handwriting that read, "Hoffman's method produces 28 ounces liquor from adult male, though quality inferior to child's extract." This historical vanishing act was caused by a number of factors. Our subject left no signed works, in contrast to the well-known anatomists of his time who wrote treatises. After 1635, records of unapproved dissections were actively suppressed by church authorities. Most tellingly, entire neighborhoods were cleared of residents during the plague years he worked there. Entire lives simply disappeared without a trace. Instead of first-person accounts, what little we do know is based on second-hand accusations. To avoid detection, he probably used several aliases. While a cathedral ledger records the funeral costs for one Dr. Merton's assistant, who passed away under suspicious circumstances, tax rolls reveal a Johann Wilhelm physician residing on a riverbank property during the pertinent time period. The variety alludes to a man who is continuously redefining his professional identity as controversies escalate, in addition to secrecy. At first, his work was accepted by local academics. In 1618, according to early correspondence, the university procurator lent him scales and alembics. However, when neighbors started complaining about strange smells, tolerance gave way to indignation. By 1624, even his fellow doctors disowned him. The medical college minutes document a vote to no longer associate with the flesh boiler. In 1621, a burgher complained, "The stench from the Hungarian's house causes women to miscarry." When archivists found a sealed letter under floorboards close to his suspected workshop in 1997, it was the closest we've come to learning who he really was. Paleographers verified that the ink and paper were from the right era, and the damaged parchment mentions my esteemed colleague Dr. Christoph von Hartitsch and your remarkable experiments with vital essences. It's the only surviving document that might have his name and a link to the experiments, though it's not absolute proof. This mysterious character thought he was about to make a huge discovery that would be convincing enough to support practices that appalled his peers. What kind of philosophy would allow the use of boiling human remains for scientific purposes? A radical reinterpretation of human anatomy that was then prevalent in Europe's underground scientific circles holds the key to the solution. Europe was divided between 2 conceptions of the human body in the early 1600s. While the most daring anatomists, such as Vesalius, advocated for hands-on dissection, mainstream doctors continued to adhere to Galen's teachings regarding the 4 humors. However, Our scientist lived in an unfamiliar intellectual realm. His notebooks demonstrate an obsession with Paracelsus's idea of the archeus, a vital force thought to regulate life processes. He felt that cadavers held tangible remnants of this essence just waiting to be extracted, while others viewed them as teaching tools. Later, neighbors remembered hearing him debate the salt of life with co-workers at tavern debates. According to witnesses, he would poke his finger into the table to demonstrate his belief that the soul and body were chemically bound rather than distinct. This made him oppose the Church's belief in spiritual immortality, as well as the emphasis on bodily fluid balance in mainstream medicine. Reading about Egyptian mummification, not the wrappings but the way that heating some organs produced resinous substances, was his turning point. This demonstrated to him that the life essence could be made tangible by carefully applying heat. In his framework, the methodology made twisted sense. Purposeful decomposition could isolate the archeus if it survived death as a physical residue. Rapid boiling, he hypothesized, would break down tissue barriers and prevent putrefaction-related contamination. According to his calculations, the ideal extraction took place for precisely 6 hours at 98 degrees Celsius, which is slightly below the boiling point of water. By using metallic transmutation to find the elixir of life, medieval alchemists thought they had missed the most obvious source material: human remains. He used a rudimentary cost-benefit analysis to defend the atrocities. Police later discovered jars labeled with ratios such as 3 infant femurs, 1 elderly liver, and recipes defining donor ages. One marginal note reads, 60 bodies might yield 1 immortal. He became increasingly anxious about time constraints in his later writings, believing that he would soon run out of new specimens due to the 30 Years' War. By 1627, cemetery robberies had escalated to more overt means, which can be explained by this urgency. The procedure represented a distorted interpretation of valid research. Adolescent cadavers lost mass more slowly than adult cadavers, as he noted in his careful weight records before and after boiling. Viscosity and color changes in the resultant fluids were monitored by charts. He viewed every corpse as a unique experiment, frequently reboiling the same remains several times to test extraction efficiency, in contrast to grave robbers who sold bodies to medical schools. Authorities discovered ledgers recording 217 distinct processings over an 11-year period when they eventually raided his workspace. His ultimate objective was substantia fixa, a purified solid residue that he claimed contained concentrated life force rather than some magical potion. According to a former assistant's testimony, the scientist held up a flask of amber-colored syrup and declared, "Herein lies eternity." Later, chemical analysis revealed that the syrup was primarily adipocera, grave wax made from decomposing fat, combined with leftover bone minerals. However, to its inventor, it was the tangible evidence of his hypothesis. The real horror is how closely his methods resembled the accepted science of the time. Human remains were boiled in the same copper stills that were used to distill medicinal herbs. Temperatures were recorded during reductions using accurate thermometers. He even took notes in a manner similar to that of doctors with medical degrees. Because of this appearance of method, his writing is incredibly unnerving. Not the ramblings of a lunatic, but the methodical quest of a man who thought he was about to die. The next thing he needed were bodies, lots of them. Additionally, shortages in plague-ravaged Prague led to unforeseen opportunities. The legal acquisition of cadavers in Prague in the 1620s was subject to stringent procedures. By municipal decree, medical schools were only allowed to dissect the bodies of executed criminals. However, demand was always greater than supply. While most anatomists relied on a black market that sucked unclaimed corpses from hospitals and orphanages, wealthy burghers could pay gravediggers to turn a blind eye. For someone looking for bodies illegally, this made the ideal cover. According to records, our scientist first engaged in these illegal but widespread practices. For example, a 1621 university complaint details his unlawful purchase of a consumptive's remains for 12 thalers from a hospital orderly. The larger the scale of his experiments, the more aggressive his methods became. Suspicious gaps are found in church burial logs, especially in the pauper sections of cemeteries. In April 1623, Elizabeth Bower was buried in St. Stephen's churchyard. 3 days later, the sexton ordered the grave to be exhumed. Only stones were found in the coffin, but no formal investigation was conducted. The 1625 outbreak's civic records mention that one mass grave looked disturbed with multiple bodies, diminished in number. Later gathered witness statements describe seeing a hooded figure pushing a handcart near plague houses at night, always during heavy fog. Plague pits offered richer hunting grounds. He most likely had assistants. An idiot boy is described in trial documents from 1628 as carrying bundles wrapped in sailcloth to and from the workshop by the river. A washerwoman testified that the stench ruined her linens, and that she witnessed 2 men loading casks labeled brine onto barges. The story of a former assistant who became an informant is the most damning. It describes how they would pretend to be plague wardens in order to take bodies straight from deathbeds. According to the informant, they once gave 3 pfennigs to a distraught mother for her stillborn child because they felt it needed sanitary burning. By 1626, actual cases of missing persons were emerging. The city guard refused to look into the disappearance of an apprentice who delivered a package to the foreign doctor, according to a cloth merchant's diary. More concerning are coroner reports that indicate a rise in drowning victims with unusual injuries that were recovered from the Moldau. In a rudimentary attempt at surgical closure, one such victim, a traveling tinker discovered in 1627, had his abdomen sewn shut with waxed thread. Internal organs absent is all that is stated in the coroner's note before the drowning is declared accidental. Ethical boundaries gradually disappeared. According to reports, our subject became impatient with decomposition timelines, whereas the majority of resurrection men at least waited for burial. In a letter that has survived, an alchemical supplier is asked for 2 ounces of quicklime for purification purposes, a chemical that is known to hasten the decomposition of flesh. He had completely done away with middlemen by 1628. The city's beggar population significantly decreased during this time, with 12 disappearances recorded in 6 months. Several testimonies mention hearing screams from his riverbank property at night, but magistrates dismissed these as drunkards' fantasies. A bargeman's sworn statement from the 1630 investigation provides the most credible account. He told of taking an enigmatic customer who paid 3 times as much for upstream nighttime trips. He saw one bundle move a little as he watched 6 sleeping passengers wrapped in burlap being loaded on one such trip. His client claimed they were fevered patients headed to a sanatorium when questioned. It was the bargeman's testimony that ultimately led to the raid, when he later recognized his passenger from a lineup as the same man university records refer to as the distillation master. What authorities found in his workshop by the river went against all medical ethics of the time. At first glance, the arrangement seemed surprisingly typical, just another apothecary's workspace among the numerous labs in Prague. However, the apparatus conveyed a completely different message. The typical anatomy theater in Prague during the 17th century looked like a lecture hall combined with a surgeon's workshop. Shining brass scales, rows of labeled jars with anatomical specimens, and meticulously arranged dissection tools were all on clean wooden tables. Physicians valued light and order, and in order to properly examine tissues, the majority worked with multiple oil lamps or close to large windows. The distillation master, on the other hand, worked in perpetual twilight in his laboratory by the river. Witnesses later reported that only 2 tiny whale oil lamps were used to provide hazy illumination, and that sailcloth curtains were nailed over each window. 7 enormous copper kettles, each big enough to accommodate an adult human, were set up in a semicircle in his workspace in place of the customary single dissection table. These were connected to condensation coils that dripped into ceramic collection vessels through glass tubing. The modifications were most chilling. One kettle had interior markings measuring depth in handspans, and another had a perforated, false bottom that resembled a giant steamer basket. The inventory confiscated by the authorities listed 3 iron hooks for lifting, 1 brass pump for evacuation, 12 yards of lead piping. He kept up a semblance of legitimacy. Standard medical texts and herbaria that one might anticipate finding in a doctor's quarters were found in the outer rooms. However, the story was different in the inner workroom. A sketch that has survived from the city bailiff depicts walls covered in charcoal calculations that record yield ratios and boiling times. The floor sloped towards a central drain, its iron grate permanently stained reddish-brown, and shelves held dozens of glass jars with handwritten labels such as Extract 43, Male age 19, Skull origin, and Condensate, Female pelvis, third boiling. His biggest logistical problem was the stench. Ordinary anatomy theaters covered up smells with vinegar-soaked cloths or by burning aromatic herbs. More drastic measures were developed by our subject. A spice merchant's ledger reveals regular sales of 4 pounds clove oil to the Riverside doctor, enough to stifle even the most repulsive decomposition odors, and witnesses saw his assistants transporting barrels of lye from tanneries. The constant haze of smoke from his chimney eventually became familiar to the neighbors, who assumed it was from pharmaceutical preparations. The more descriptions of his actual workspace that survive, the more unsettling they become. The most graphic account comes from Father Carroll, the priest who accompanied authorities during the 1630 raid. But an apprentice who ran away in 1628 told magistrates about racks of bones drying like tobacco leaves, and tubs of brine with things floating. According to his letter to the archbishop, he entered the inner chamber and discovered a copper vessel yet boiling, wherein lay the partial remains of what appeared to be a young person, the flesh separating from the bones like overdone poultry. The priest remarked on the careful arrangement, with tools set out with surgical precision, and logbooks open to record data even in the midst of this horror. The scene's clinical atmosphere was what made it particularly unnerving. This was a methodical laboratory where human remains were processed in a methodical manner, not some witch's chaotic den. 12 identical flasks of pale yellow fluid were found on one shelf labeled prime virginal matter, and the bailiff's report mentions finding specimen jars arranged by purported potency. Unholy patience was evident in every detail, as this gory craft was refined over months or years. The actual boiling procedure was conducted according to exacting guidelines, documented in ledgers with the same level of care as any legitimate, scientific investigation. Experiments at increasingly higher temperatures are documented in temperature logs, with previous attempts criticized as insufficiently vigorous in their attempts to break down connective tissues. These gruesome experiments led to the development of his final methodology, a 6-step procedure that turned entire cadavers into tiny vials of murky liquid. The 2 main methods of preservation in the 1620s were either storing corpses in fortified wines for dissection or dry salting them for anatomical study. By making precise incisions that allowed for repeated examination of the same specimen, surgeons took pride in keeping cadavers intact for as long as possible. These methods were completely disapproved of by the distillation master. According to his notebooks, he believed that preservation destroyed the volatile compounds that make up life itself. He saw decomposition as a necessary refining process, while others saw it as the enemy. His process started with careful planning. Authorities discovered ledger entries that described how each cadaver was weighed on industrial wool scales that could weigh more than 300 pounds after first being cleaned in vinegar. Strategic dismemberment was the next step. He divided bodies into uniform segments using cleavers according to a numbered grid system, in contrast to anatomists who meticulously separated organs. A human silhouette is depicted on one of the surviving pages, separated into 18 numbered sections that resemble cuts of meat. The notes indicate which areas are thought to have higher concentrations of vital essences. The core of his approach was temperature control. His specialized kettles used a system of water baths and coal vents to maintain precise temperatures. In order to loosen the gross matter, he started with a preliminary simmer at 60 degrees Celsius for 2 hours, according to logbooks. This first broth was thrown away as waste. The actual extraction took place during 6 hours of secondary, boiling at a precise temperature of 98 degrees, which is slightly lower than the boiling point of water. During this phase, Witnesses saw assistants continuously modifying furnace drafts to maintain the liquid at a steady quiver that was just shy of bubbling. To increase yield, he employed specialized tools. To keep the mixture from sticking, copper paddles stirred it every 15 minutes, and some bones were submerged separately in perforated baskets. 6 iron head cages, which are probably used to keep skulls submerged during processing, are mentioned in inventory lists. A brass press used to extract leftover fluids from boiled tissue was the most unsettling piece of apparatus. According to Father Carroll's account, he discovered its still warm and unmistakable fragments caught in the screw threads. Boiling stopped, and processing went on. The resultant broth was further reduced over low heat after passing through linen filters into secondary containers. A time-consuming decanting procedure that divided fluids into layers based on density was required for the final extraction. Employees removed the densest sediments, preserved the middle aqueous layer, and skimmed the floating fats. An obsession with yields is evident in account books. One entry regrets wasting near 2 drams of spirit because the flask was cracked. His subsequent experiments revealed the most gory step. He started sequential processing, reboiling the same residue several times with different pH levels, in an attempt to increase potency. In order to extract previously locked minerals, a marginal note from 1627 suggests recycling bones through quicklime baths in between boilings. This explains why human remains at different stages of decomposition were found during the raid. Some had been repeatedly treated until they were nearly skeletal. All of these improvements came together in his final method to create a vicious efficiency. Over the course of 9 days, cadaver segments underwent 3 full boilings, with careful documentation documenting the amount of fluid lost at each stage. In stark contrast to the massive initial mass, the final product only filled 1 or 2 tiny glass vials per body. According to recent chemical analyses of artifacts from the same period, this concentrate primarily contained degraded proteins, potassium salts, and ammonia compounds, all of which are worthless alchemical waste by today's standards. However, the distillation master thought he had caught something much more valuable in those hazy droplets. According to his notebooks, he held the finished extract up to candlelight in an attempt to detect the elusive, golden shimmer that was said to be a sign of a successful essence capture. His research on immortality was built around this substance, which is a physical representation of the soul itself that is just awaiting the right administration technique. Alchemists of the 17th century exchanged formulas for the quintessence, a second fabled 5th element that was said to hold the spark of life. It was disputed by mainstream doctors whether this essence was found in nervous spirits, lymph, or blood. However, our scientist rejected these hypotheses as lacking. According to his notebooks, the actual animating force was a volatile salt that precipitated during decomposition rather than any liquid. When human tissue decomposed under controlled heat, a crystalline residue known as sal animatus was left behind. Conventional wisdom was reversed by his theory. This man thought immortality was concealed in the byproducts of corruption, whereas Paracelsus sought life in pure substances. There are comprehensive tables relating cadaver age, boiling time, and salt yield in the ledgers that were taken from his workshop. According to one noteworthy entry, 1 ounce of prime materia, enough for 1 experimental dose, could be produced by 7 teenage corpses. He assigned the highest quality specimens the label etheric in shaky script after grading the extracts according to their clarity and crystalline patterning. His fixation on purity was reflected in the way he stored things. During the raid, 42 blue glass vials with a thumb-sized amount of yellowish powder inside, cushioned in boxes lined with lead, were discovered. Authorities discovered a smaller, iron chest with 3 crystal ampules bearing the label Prima Materia Absoluta underneath these. According to notebooks, only containers that had previously been used to store mercury could stop spiritual leakage, a notion that echoes old alchemical customs regarding conductive metals maintaining mystical qualities. Self-experimentation started out slowly. Applying diluted solutions to animal test subjects is described in early journal entries. Emboldened, he moved on to human trials. A somber 1626 note documents feeding sparrows increasing concentrations until one dropped dead mid-flight, then revived after 6 minutes. The informant recalled witnessing him inject a forearm with a murky fluid before he collapsed into convulsions, and a laundress later testified to discovering blood-stained bandages in his trash. When his methods were examined, the science behind them broke down. According to contemporary analysis, his prized sal animatus was primarily composed of calcium and potassium phosphate salts, which are common byproducts of tissue breakdown. There was no scientific evidence to support his theory that heating could reactivate these minerals. Ironically, any real organic compounds that might have had biological activity were destroyed during the boiling process. His last writings revealed his strangest belief. He came to the conclusion that the essence of life was topological, a physical pattern encoded in the crystalline structure itself, rather than chemical, after years of failures. The powder was supposed to rebuild a body from any remaining DNA fragments, a concept that was both bizarrely prescient and completely misguided. One feverish diagram depicts hexagonal salt crystals arranged to form a human silhouette with the annotation, "As above in heaven, so below in the glass." He might have been broken by the last experiment. The final entry before his disappearance is 7 grains administered sublingually at midnight. Visions of the black sun. The salt remembers. No records verify whether this was a hallucination or some toxic reaction. A singed ledger page from 1629 describes adding mercury to the purified salt in an attempt to create a incorruptible amalgam. Instead of immortality, he left behind a hideous mockery of the scientific method. Only bone meal and broken-down proteins were present in 52 carefully labeled vials. His notebooks were a mind methodically recording its disintegration, combining exact measurements with insane metaphysical leaps. Hundreds of lives were reduced to chemical curiosities in search of an impossible goal, symbolized by the jars of glittering powder. Unavoidably, word got out through the winding streets of Prague. The resurrectionist's elixirs were rumored by people far outside the medical field, including those who could put a permanent stop to his experiments. He operated in a working-class neighborhood of tanners, boatmen, and small merchants along the river, not some remote enclave. In the alleys between his workshop and St. Agnes's bakery, kids played stickball. Every morning, women congregated at the communal well and shared stories over pails of water. For years, his actions were just another strange doctor among Prague's many strange characters, blending into the background noise of city life. Missing bodies had nothing to do with the initial complaints. A wine merchant filed a lawsuit in 1624 over damaged stock kept close to his property, alleging that a vileness in the air had made his casks sour. Due to a lack of evidence, the court dismissed the case. Initially, there were more hygienic concerns than criminal ones. Neighbors complained of greasy residue clogging the shared cistern, and night soil collectors reported unusually high waste loads from his address. In a 1625 report, a guild inspector mentions noxious vapors coming from his chimney, but explains them away as the result of legal pharmaceutical activity. The truth was hidden in plain sight. Everyone knew that doctors handled cadavers, and the city's ongoing plague epidemic normalized death. They wouldn't understand how differently he treated the deceased until much later. His avoidance strategies were based on social dynamics. He made sure that petty bribes outweighed curiosity by giving the dockmaster protection money and occasionally paying consultation fees to local officials. The district constable merely told the butcher's wife to draw her curtains after she reported seeing suspicious bundles being carried after midnight. The workshop's location was advantageous because it was sandwiched between a tannery and an abattoir, so no one paid much attention to its smells. Chemical odors were ostensibly covered by the monthly deliveries of juniper and lavender from the spice markets. In 1627, the first conflict occurred. On a partially dissected arm in the trash heap, a gravedigger by the name of Matej identified the unique birthmark of his own cousin. He allegedly received a bottle of strengthening tonic and 8 silver groschen in exchange for remaining silent when he confronted the scientist. It's unclear from the records whether Matej drank himself to death within the year due to guilt or something in that bottle. Similarly, magistrates accepted the explanation that the adolescent son of Widow Huber had joined a mercenary company when he disappeared after running an errand to the riverside. He was shielded for longer than necessary by social hierarchies. His word carried disproportionate weight because he was an educated man among laborers. Because they valued his medical expertise over suspicions, the same neighbors who had whispered about strange lights at his windows continued to bring him their ailments. No one took any action, even after kids started reciting a rhyme about the bone doctor's boiling pot. Due to the district's migrant population, which included unemployed soldiers, displaced peasants, and plague survivors, disappearances rarely prompted an investigation. An unexpected quarter proved to be the decisive factor. Brother Lucas, a Carmelite novice, became fixated on the workshop in 1629 after observing a swarm of flies during the winter months. Records of his monastery show nightly watch of the property, with carts arriving with burdens wrapped like swaddled infants. One evening, the young monk broke in and reportedly saw a fresh cadaver being processed in its final stages. Instead of reporting to non-religious authorities, he went straight to Archbishop Herrick. Everything changed when the church got involved. Within days, the archbishop sent armed retainers to areas where local authorities had ignored the situation. During the ember days of Lent, when the faithful reflect on death, the raid took place at dawn on March 3, 1630. Apprentices escaped through the river gate as 6 men broke down the door, according to watchmen's logs. They discovered both commonplace and supernatural horrors within. Ledgers that described payments made to grave robbers, as well as chapel-like configurations of specimen jars that resembled reliquaries. When interrogators coerced his elderly assistant into confessing to obtaining at least 18 bodies through fictitious plague quarantines, the pieces finally came together. An ecclesiastical trial with 67 counts of sacrilege resulted from what started as neighborhood rumors. Even so, the community found it difficult to reconcile the horrific acts with the man they had known. Believing that he had been set up by jealous co-workers, the baker's daughter kept bringing him honey cakes while he was incarcerated. Others claimed to have witnessed lights in his deserted workshop still moving, as though the experiments were still taking place there without permission. A tacit agreement that such things couldn't possibly be real had allowed the truth to fester among them for almost 10 years. The distillation master had already disappeared from custody under suspicious circumstances by the time authorities dismantled his operation. Some whispered darker explanations involving his unfinished elixirs, while others said he bribed his jailers. The powder vials, the discolored copper kettles, and the unanswered question of whether these atrocities had produced anything truly useful to science were all that were left. The answer would come from a surprising place. The medical establishment of the early 17th century was unable to determine whether the distillation master's work was the product of primitive genius or dangerous heresy. Although mainstream medical professionals such as Dr. Johannes Marcus Marci of Prague disregarded his techniques as butchery masquerading as chemistry, other academics' private correspondence shows cautious interest. In 1626, 3 of the man's fluid samples were reportedly taken by an anatomist named John Gesenius, who conducted the first public dissection in Bohemia. According to his notes, they were tested on hospital patients who were near death, but no therapeutic benefits were found. Several unintended discoveries with genuine scientific value were made as a result of the experiments. His careful recording of tissue reduction rates and boiling temperatures inadvertently provided early forensic investigators with valuable information. His research on the effects of extended heating on bone integrity during the identification of charred remains was cited in a 1634 murder trial. More importantly, the earliest known description of saponification under controlled conditions was found in his notes on the formation of adipocere, that grave wax substance that he mistakenly believed to be life essence. Although he did not identify the unsettling source of these observations, the French chemist Guillaume Dupuytren would give them credit in his 1833 studies of post-mortem chemistry. His preservation methods were covertly modified by a number of contemporaries. Modified versions of his vinegar and quicklime washes were reportedly used by barber surgeons performing battlefield triage during the 30 Years' War to prevent gangrene. This selective borrowing was common. His practical discoveries proved useful once divorced from their philosophical framework. For example, a 1639 Leipzig medical text describes a wound irrigation method that is suspiciously similar to the distillation master's preliminary cadaver cleaning process, but it credits the technique to an Italian physician. In pharmacology, the most sinister legacy surfaced. Some of his preparation techniques produced surprising outcomes in spite of his overall failure. One batch unintentionally contained high levels of potassium nitrate, according to a chemical analysis of the surviving vials. This could account for the test animal's brief revival effects. Early resuscitation experiments were influenced by this unintentional discovery of the stimulant qualities of crude potassium salts. Similar compounds are suggested in a 1658 Amsterdam manual on drowning victims. This manual was probably based on notes that were copied and circulated through underground medical networks. Methodology, not results, was his real scientific contribution. The methodical approach to material logging and temperature controls established a standard for subsequent laboratory procedures. This disgraced scientist had pioneered, albeit gruesomely, procedures that chemist Robert Boyle built upon when he set standards for experimental documentation in the 1660s. Unlike most respectable researchers of his time, the surviving ledgers are remarkably consistent in recording variables such as ambient temperature, humidity, and lunar phases. His work had the most unexpected afterlife in metallurgy. Mining engineers in Joachimsthal took notice of his notes on the resistance of copper alloys to organic acids. By 1642, silver was being extracted from inferior ores using modified versions of his boiling tanks. The miners probably had no idea that their tools came from human remains experiments, but this industrial use was the only undeniable benefit of his research. He was never given credit in any official scientific publication. A letter from 1667 mentioning those continental attempts at vital extraction is the only vague mention of him in the Royal Society's archives, but for almost a century after his disappearance, doctors in Europe covertly exchanged samples bearing his alchemical symbols. In 1672, Isaac Newton even recorded in his notebooks that he had acquired Hartwigskian preparations from a German contact. Underground interest in his work continued because of the very fame that condemned him. Only pieces of a terrible puzzle remain today. His few surviving vials have undergone modern forensic analysis, which verifies that they only contain heavy metal contaminants and normal decomposition byproducts. The horrifying reality is that hundreds of lives were lost in order to create compounds that could be easily duplicated by any skilled chemist using simple laboratory apparatus and animal tissue today. His lasting contribution was a warning about how easily exacting methodology can be used to achieve irrational goals rather than a breakthrough in science. That insight forces us to face a troubling query regarding humanity's never-ending struggle with mortality. Terrifying reality emerges from the distillation master's experiments. People's fear of dying can be used as an excuse for nearly anything. His tale serves as a mirror for the immortality projects of our own time, not just a tale of one man's plunge into horror. The same passion he brought to boiling flesh is now used by billionaires to finance cryonics and AI mind uploading. When science seeks immortality, moral boundaries become hazy. Gene editing labs have taken the place of his copper kettles, but the fundamental query is still the same. How much suffering is justified in the name of avoiding death? His legacy compels us to consider whether, with improved technology, we are making the same mistakes he did.